Carlos was a police officer who moved around the city like a king in his domain. With more than 15 years of service, he had built a reputation as an unbeatable force. Respected by his colleagues and feared by criminals, his presence was enough to unsettle even the most daring. However, this strength was accompanied by a shadow: his aggressiveness. Every approach was marked by a heavy hand, an authoritative tone of voice that left little room for questioning. He believed that violence was a necessity in a world that knew no boundaries, and this belief shaped not only his professional interactions but also his personal life. Carlos, at home, carried the same intensity. The pressure of work isolated him, creating a barrier between him and his family. That day, tension was building. He was about to leave for another patrol when his cell phone vibrated, bringing a wave of anxiety. A video of a violent approach he had recently carried out was circulating on social media. The image of a young man being attacked, his pleas for help echoing on the screen, shocked the community. Carlos felt the ground shake beneath his feet. The phone rang again, this time with the voice of his superior, calling him to an emergency meeting. Despair invaded his chest. He knew that the moment of truth had arrived. The hero's fall was about to begin, and the fall would be painful. As Carlos drove to the police station, his mind was buzzing with memories of the past. He often remembered his childhood, marked by a tumultuous relationship with his father, a man who saw himself as a defender of the family, but who often gave in to violence. Afternoons that should have been moments of joy became scenes of conflict, where screams and punches filled the air, and young Carlos hid in the corner of his room, wishing everything were different. These memories haunted him, shaping his understanding of what it meant to be strong. For him, strength meant control, and control meant violence. When his peers praised him for acting with a firm hand, he felt validated, as if he were following a legacy. But now, amid mounting pressure from the community and social media, a seed of doubt was beginning to sprout. Along the way, he saw the faces of people he knew, citizens who had respected and feared him, but who were now furious. At every corner, he could feel the tension, the anger that pulsed through the city's veins. The echo of his actions reverberated everywhere, becoming a constant reminder of the man he was and what he could have become. When he arrived at the police station, the atmosphere was filled with murmurs. Colleagues were talking about the video, and Carlos could see a mixture of fear and apprehension in their eyes. He knew that the situation was about to heat up, and the meeting would become a battlefield. As he waited for the summons, he felt his heart race, guilt and shame beginning to take over his mind. When he finally entered the meeting room, he faced his superior, who seemed ready to confront him. The words that would be said next could change his life forever. Carlos took a deep breath, trying to find the strength that had always sustained him. But inside, insecurity was eating away at him. The room was tense when Carlos entered, and the gazes of his colleagues weighed on him like a sentence. The police chief, a man of imposing presence, wasted no time. With a firm voice, he began to present the facts. The video that was circulating, the community's outrage, and the consequences that could befall everyone. Carlos felt his defenses crumble. The chief's words were like blades, cutting through his image of bravery and control. He tried to justify his actions, talking about the need to protect the city, but his attempts seemed hollow in the face of the growing backlash. The silence in the room was deafening, and the feeling of being on the receiving end of others' judgment was almost unbearable. One of his colleagues, a young officer named Daniel, raised his hand. "Carlos, you need to understand that this isn't just about you. These are lives you've affected. What can we do to make it right?" Daniel's words sounded like a challenge, and Carlos felt as if his armor was being stripped away. Humiliation was growing inside him like an unquenchable fire. He had never considered that his aggression could be a problem. He had always thought he was doing what was necessary. But now, confronted by his own conscience and the voices of his peers, the truth began to seep in. Maybe he hadn't been so right after all. The meeting dragged on, but Carlos was no longer listening. His mind was stuck in painful reflection on the impact of his actions and what he had lost. The weight of shame would follow him no matter what happened next. After the meeting, Carlos left the police station with a heavy head. The chief's words and the disappointed looks on his colleagues' faces echoed in his mind. To relieve the pressure, he decided to take a walk around the neighborhood where he had grown up, hoping that the familiarity would help him find some clarity. However, as he walked through the streets that had once seemed so familiar, all he felt was a deep unease. As he watched people go about their daily lives, he noticed a group gathering in front of a store. A sign held up by a young man caught his attention: "Say no to police brutality." Anger welled up in his chest, but as he got closer, he recognized the young man. It was Lucas, the boy from the video. The image of the assaulted man and his pleas invaded his mind. Carlos's heart raced. He wanted to look away, but he couldn't. Lucas, now in a posture of resistance, was speaking to the protesters, expressing his experiences and demands for change. Hearing Lucas's voice, something inside Carlos broke. He decided to approach, feeling compelled to confront the young man who had been bothering him so much. "Lucas," Carlos began, his voice hesitant, I'm sorry for what happened. I didn't know. I didn't mean to hurt you." The words came out as a whisper, barely audible over the hubbub of the crowd. Lucas turned to him, his eyes full of indignation. "You didn't want to? But you did. And now, what are you going to do about it? Continue this cycle of violence?" The challenge in Lucas's words hit Carlos like a punch in the stomach. For a brief moment, Carlos found himself in Lucas's shoes, feeling the pain and frustration. The confrontation was intense and emotionally charged. Carlos tried to defend himself, but his words seemed weak. I just wanted to do what was right," he said, fighting back the tears that threatened to escape. Lucas was unfazed. Doing what is right cannot mean hurting others. You need to understand that. With that, he turned and rejoined the group, leaving Carlos alone with his thoughts. The young man had planted a seed of doubt that was now germinating within him. The city was in turmoil. The protest where Carlos had met Lucas had spread quickly, drawing more people by the hour. The voices of thousands echoed through the streets, calling for justice and change. Carlos couldn't shake the feeling that everything was about to explode. He knew that tensions between the police and the community were at an all-time high, and the next move could be dangerous. On a gray morning, the call for an emergency operation arrived. The orders were clear: control the protest and ensure that there was no violence. Carlos prepared himself, his heart beating fast, not only from the adrenaline of work, but also from the uncertainty about his own role. In this new scenario, as he drove to the protest site, he replayed his conversation with Lucas in his mind. The young man's words echoed, and doubt became a growing weight in his chest. What does it mean to do what's right? He wondered. What had become of his role as a police officer? To be an advocate or an oppressor? Upon arriving, Carlos took in the scene before him. The crowd was agitated, but mostly peaceful. Signs were held high, people were shouting, their faces full of hope and despair. He spotted Lucas in the crowd, talking passionately, and an impulse made him want to approach. But before he could act, Carlos's team's commands were given, and the mood quickly changed. A provocation from a protester made the situation heated up. The tension grew like a storm about to break. Carlos saw a colleague push a young man who was just trying to film the scene with his cell phone. Chaos ensued. The screams became louder, and panic began to spread. At that moment, Carlos found himself torn. A part of him wanted to act with compassion, but the pressure of the moment pushed him toward brutality. He shouted orders to control the situation, but his words were drowned out by the roar of the crowd. All around him, violence began to erupt, and the reality he knew was about to crumble. As the confusion took over, a shadow from the past haunted him. Carlos was about to make a choice that could seal his fate and the fate of many others. The atmosphere was tense, and Carlos felt his heart race as chaos unfolded before his eyes. The protest, which had begun as a peaceful call for justice, had now turned into a scene of chaos. He saw people being pushed and shoved, screams of pain and outrage echoing around him. The pressure was mounting, and frustration was starting to boil over. In an instant, a young protester advanced toward Carlos, his face contorted with rage. Without thinking, Carlos prepared to react, his hand instinctively moving toward his belt. He was about to repeat what he had done so many times before, but something inside him hesitated. "Don't do that," shouted a fellow protester, trying to intervene, but it was too late. In the heat of the moment, adrenaline took over and Carlos lost control. A gunshot rang out and panic set in among the crowd. The bullets were indiscriminate and the sound of violence became deafening. The young man fell to the ground and Carlos was paralyzed, the reality of his actions weighing down on him like an anchor. The world around him began to spin. He looked at the young man's face, now pale and still, and a wave of regret hit him hard. This wasn't just another statistic. This was a life he had cut short. What had he become? He had become the very thing he had always fought against. With tears in his eyes and a lump in his throat, Carlos realized that in that moment of impulse he had lost not only the battle, but also the part of himself that still believed in justice. The echo of his mistakes resounded, and he knew there was no going back. The line between good and evil, which he had always considered so clear, was now becoming blurred. The ground was covered in despair, and confusion filled the scene. Carlos fell to his knees, his heart beating wildly, the adrenaline quickly fading, leaving only a deep emptiness. He looked at the young man, the life he had taken, and a sharp pain filled his chest. What had happened? How could he have come to this? As the ambulance sirens approached, his mind filled with memories. He saw himself as that boy haunted by violence, hiding in his room, wishing he were different. The brutality he now perpetuated was not just a momentary flaw. It was the reflection of a cycle of pain he had carried his entire life. The weight of his choices crushed him, and the truth finally set in. He had become the very thing he feared most. A sense of helplessness took hold of him. In his final moments, as the young man's life ebbed away, Carlos felt a deep desire for redemption. He wished he could go back in time, look into the eyes of Lucas and everyone he had hurt, and apologize. He wanted to scream to the city, to those he had promised to protect, that he was wrong, that he had failed. With his head down, he felt the presence of his colleagues, now around him, in shock and despair. What had they done? What had the city become? And most of all, what had he become? The light began to fade in his eyes, and he gave in to the pain. There was no more time for change or redemption. The life he had known, marked by bravery and strength, was gone, leaving only the sadness of what could have been. As Carlos lay on his knees, the scene around him became a whirlwind of screams, sirens, and running. The crowd was in a panic, and the reality of his actions was beginning to sink in. The life of the young man who had fallen now depended on how quickly paramedics could arrive, and Carlos felt paralyzed, consumed by the horror of what he had caused. He watched the paramedics arrive, moving with an urgency that seemed like a distant echo of their actions. The voices around him became a muffled noise. The only thing he could hear was the rapid beating of his heart, mixed with the clamor of the crowd. An overwhelming sense of guilt engulfed him, as if the world were crumbling around him. In the midst of the chaos, the figure of Lucas appeared in his mind. The young man who, in the midst of the protest, had spoken with such conviction. Carlos remembered the pain in his eyes, the desire for change. He had stood against oppression, and now, ironically, Carlos had become a symbol of the violence they fought against. The thought was unbearable. With an effort, he stood up, the pain in his heart as intense as the pain in his legs. What was he supposed to do now? Could he try to defend himself, to justify his actions? But deep down, he knew that no justification could erase the reality of the life he had taken. The justice he had once sought now seemed a distant concept, almost unreal. Determined to face the consequences, Carlos began to walk away from the scene, his body heavy with the burden of what he had done. Each step took him further away from the cop he had been, but closer to a truth he finally needed to face. He was not the hero he had always thought he was. As he walked away, he felt the need to shed the uniform, not just the physical uniform, but the beliefs that had brought him to this point. It was a symbol of everything that was wrong with his approach, and now he needed a new identity, away from the violence he had chosen.